Good morning, class, or good afternoon. Today on Mr. Dini's Living Textbook, we are going to learn about a topic that is so important, it literally lasted over 50 years. And while it's part of global history, it's even more important, in my opinion, to U.S. history. Today, what we're going to be learning about is not playing in the snow, even though I'm definitely dressed for that. Today, I'm dressed up because I'm talking about a topic that is not very warm. In fact, it is incredibly icy and tension. Today, class, we are going to be learning about is the Cold War. Oh, cold water. That's good, but not what we're learning about. Take that back. Class, what we're learning about today is actually, in fact, the origins of the Cold War. Now, many of you may not know what that is, but today what we're going to do is break it down using a couple objectives. We're going to go over some intro stuff, possibly look at a couple individuals and important events of this time period. Today, class, let's get started with some objectives.
So, as we said outside class, today in Mr. Dini's Living Textbook, these will be our objectives. First, students will analyze the origins of the Cold War. Second off, students will be evaluating the Truman Doctrine, which does have a lot of different facets to it, and is very important with the idea of communism after World War II. And lastly, after that, students will finally understand the Marshall Plan. And with that, we will actually go over whether the Marshall Plan was positive or negative, and why some people tend to believe this, despite many textbooks today, in fact, writing that it was an incredibly positive event. So that will be our today's objectives. Okay, class, so with our first objective, what we are going to do is look at the origins of the Cold War. First off, obviously the Cold War is cold, but why do they call it a Cold War? They don't call it the Hot War, they don't call it the Hot Soup War, the Hot Pocket War. It's called the Cold War because the tensions were frigid, nations were unhappy with each other, and the times were not the best. But, in being a Cold War though, the weapons were also cold. Nobody fired a shot, directly though, mind you, nobody fired a shot, but this was a war mainly of puffing the chest out, letting people know that you were stronger than the other one. And mostly between, we have the United States on one side, representing democracy and capitalism, fun, and the Soviet Union representing communism, and at the same time, being anti-American and not so democratic, more dictatorship. So now that we kind of know what a Cold War is, and let's figure out where this actually came from. So World War II ends. Yes, we're going to win the big war. So we have the Treaty of Yalta between three very old men. We have FDR for the United States, who is almost on his deathbed at this point. We have Winston Churchill of Great Britain, always smoking his cigars. And we have Joseph Stalin of the USSR. So these three old men, they get together and they say, listen, we got to have a plan for Europe when this war is over. If not, what the heck is going to happen to the world? We are the three most powerful nations in the world at this point, so why don't we get together and figure out how to work out all these problems from World War II and not have another world war start? Obviously, as we know, after World War I ended, most of these problems weren't solved, which ended up leading to World War II in the first place. So these three guys thought, let's get ahead of this, all right? Let's fix this before it even happens. So World War II ends, these guys have a rough plan for what they're going to do, and instead, once World War II ends, the Cold War begins. Now, as we know from history, FDR passes away before the end of World War II. So now, our big three would be Harry Truman, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin. So with the Cold War beginning, we have these three men in power. And at this time, we have to remember that the way the war ended was the United States is here, Russia is here. They're coming in towards the middle where Berlin and Germany are. Now, when they meet in the middle, they stop fighting because obviously they're allies, but they really don't like each other that much because they have opposing views. So they meet in the middle, and then all of a sudden they say, listen, let's halt right here. But obviously, that is right where these tensions start. And on that Soviet Union side, they've gained all this territory. They have conquered Poland, Lithuania, these smaller countries, Ukraine. They don't want to just give up all that land. They want to expand that communist bloc. They want to have all that influence. The United United States says, let France be free. Let Spain, Portugal, all these other Western European countries be free. But instead, what happens is, Winston Churchill, after he doesn't win re-election for UK, comes to the United States in Fulton, Mississippi, and delivers a speech that he dubs, the Soviet Union has started the Iron Curtain.
Is this an Iron Curtain?
No, it is not really an Iron Curtain, okay, to be completely clear. What the curtain actually was a metaphor for the influence that the Soviet Union had on Eastern Europe. So this metaphorical curtain that is made of iron pushes all this influence of communism, Soviet ideas on this particular area in Eastern Europe and forces the United States to be very afraid of what to do. And at the same time, so we have this Iron Curtain pushing ideology, pushing all this strain on Eastern Europe. Then we also have the Greek Civil War, which breaks out because what is happening is there's a pro-Western government and there's a Soviet government that want to kind of come in and push this together and figure out who takes control of Greece after World War II. And nobody knows. So the United States obviously is helping work with the Greeks to fund their civil war, to fight off the Soviet Union rebels. And in the end, Greece becomes a pro-Western area and does stay with the Western ideals. At the same time though, in Soviet Union there's pressure on Turkey. They want to take up some of the naval bases, they want to take over some power because Turkey has such great access to the Mediterranean Sea and pretty much getting into the Indian Ocean and stuff like that. So they also are putting pressure on Turkey. So from all this, we're getting the origins of the Cold War. We have a failed plan to fix Europe at the end of the war. We have FDR passing away before his time. We have World War II ending, the Cold War begins, the Iron Curtain is declared. And finally, the Greek Civil War and the Soviet pressure on Turkey eventually pushes all these things to the breaking point of being the origins of the Cold War. Guys, we just finished objective number 1. So class, we've just finished with our first objective, so the next thing we're going to learn about is how to evaluate the Truman Doctrine. Now first off, you must be wondering, Harry S. Truman, who is that guy? As I said before, Harry Truman actually takes over for FDR and becomes the President of the United States following almost before the end of World War II. Harry Truman, after the war ends on June 26, 1945, proposes in a very, very important group called the United Nations. Now, as you remember after World War I, there was the League of Nations, which was a very weak, powerless diplomatic group that couldn't really do a lot. The whole point was to stop wars from happening, and clearly that didn't happen. World War II, am I right? So actually what happens is FDR proposed the United Nations, or not FDR, Harry S. Truman proposes the United Nations. Now using this peacekeeping group, the aim is to avoid war before it breaks out by using a kind of a nice area to talk about problems, break problems down, rather than just point a gun at people and just start shooting. So this group is passed on June 26, 1945, all part of Truman's idea that he wanted to have more peace in the world and avoid another giant war with destruction. So then, after that, in March 1947, about roughly a little bit less than 2 years later, he goes before Congress and announces the Truman Doctrine. Now what he does with the Truman Doctrine is the whole point of it is that he sees this crisis in Greece, this civil war. He sees the Turks being trying to take over by the Soviet Union. So he proposed the Truman Doctrine. Now what this is it's going to give people military, like guns, weapons, troops, and economic aid to countries trying to avoid communism. So essentially it's care packages and aid to avoid being taken over by communists. Now obviously, if I give you $5 and I say, hey, be my friend, you're more likely to be my friend if I give you money than if I give you no money at all. So essentially this money is kind of, and this more so than money, also military aid, it's really saying, be more of my friend and you'll get more of these supplies to save yourself. So that's great and all, but it's kind of controversial. And even further with this policy, he has something called containment, which is essentially the idea that they're going to contain communism and stop it from spreading. And this policy was actually forefronted by a man named George F. Kennan, who was a diplomat who was really high-end on Soviet matters and culture. And he said, if we don't contain communism, it's going to spread. So Truman adopts part of, in his doctrine, the fact that he wants to have containment in it and stop other countries from spreading communism by, condensing and crushing it down so it can't escape and grow out to the rest of the world. So now, what do you guys think? Adam?
Mr. Mr. Didi, how can you really contain something for communism?
All right, any more questions? Yeah, Jason, go ahead.
Yo, teach, that Truman Doctrine is weak.
Well, actually, Jason and Adam, what we're doing here is looking at and evaluating the Truman Doctrine itself. Now, as you said, is containment really a great policy? Well, the United States thought it was the best thing to do at the time. Now, can you really contain an idea like communism? No, you really can't. But Americans at this time thought they really could. And like I said right here, it was hailed by the United States as a landmark approach to fight communism. Give money to people, have them avoid communism. Keep them approachable and close enough that you don't have to ever go back on them and lose them to communism because communism was so frightening back then. No! But at the same time, though, for evaluating this is a really big step from how the United States was operating following World War I when we were really stuck in isolationism. You know, Warren G. Harding, Herbert Hoover, even FDR at the very beginning of World War II really didn't want to get involved. But now this new Truman Doctrine comes in, and essentially the Truman Doctrine is involving us in places all around the world. And as you'll see later on in this chapter, throughout the 1950s with the Korean War and later on the Vietnam War, this policy really does get us entrenched into a lot of foreign conflicts. And we even see that today a lot going on where we're involved in the Middle East, involved in Latin America. But this Truman Doctrine really is a step away from isolationism, breaking from that policy and getting more involved around the world. So was it a good thing? Some people think it was. Was it a bad idea? Others think it maybe got us too involved in the rest of the world and not so much focused on what was going on at home. Alright? So now, guys, just finished objective number 2. Nice work. So, we are in our last objective class for Mr. Didi's living textbook. The final thing we're going to do today is to understand the Marshall Plan. So the Marshall Plan obviously was this huge package of aid the United States dropped in Europe. Well, let's reverse that. First, we know that at the end of World War II, Europe lay in ruins. Tons of bombing raids, war, destruction had left most of Europe in rubble and pretty much flattened to the ground. So how do they rebuild? How does anybody rebuild after a crisis? Well, the Secretary of War at this time, a guy named George Marshall, proposed an aid package called the Marshall Plan, which was the equivalent, which would actually be $13 billion back then. From 1948 to 1951, the plan was to use money and aid to drop off food, supplies, help build up cities, help build up populations, give them aid, support, medical supplies too. And if you really want to put that in context, $13 billion today would be $136 billion. Essentially, you could buy every sports team in every major sport in America and still have money left over. But that's just a crazy amount of money the United States is spending, especially after we just spent so much on the war. But our first instinct was, well, Czechoslovakia might fall into communism, so maybe this can fall into our major point, which we just went over, as the Truman Doctrine and containment. The Marshall Plan all flows right into this idea that we need to stop communism, and by using all this aid and money, we can help contain it and keep people from turning over to communism. Now, with this plan, not a single Western European country fell to communism. And that is a fact. Every country that received aid did not become communist. And a lot of Americans back then, a lot of leaders and stuff like that, so that was a huge victory. We did a great job. But a lot more lately, especially now, your textbook will usually textbooks tell you that the Marshall Plan was this amazing idea, one of a kind, we helped save Europe, or the reason Europe exists today. Was it all good though? Because a lot of people today think that maybe all that money was a bad idea. A lot of money given out to politicians, you get corruption, maybe it's not spent properly, maybe we're wasting some of that money. Another thing that you want to think about is a lot of these countries were actually growing before. We're actually rebuilding before this money. I mean, the war ends in 1945 and we wait 3 years to give them aid. So, just something to think about more as we go into the rest of this chapter, that maybe the Marshall Plan wasn't all that good. Just to have another perspective on it. Our textbooks and the American idea falls behind that, always giving out aid to foreign countries is a good idea, but, this actually, some people say, may have actually kept Europe from building up that quickly. A lot of people think maybe this kind of stalled them out and allowed the United States to grow so quickly, while Europe kind of struggled for a couple of years, minus West Germany. So, was it all good? Maybe. But that's just to give you two different perspectives on what the incredibly powerful and important Marshall Plan was in the very beginning of the Cold War in Europe. Class, we have finished the last objective. Congratulations, we have learned about the Cold War origins. Class, we've made it through all of Mr. Dede's living textbook objectives for today with the origins of the Cold War. So today we went over looking at how the Cold War began and identifying the factors that were started there. We evaluated the Truman Doctrine. Was it a good thing? Was it a bad thing? Maybe it was too involved. Maybe it was not enough involved. But it was all in the purpose of containing communism. And finally, we went over the Marshall Plan, which we also considered maybe it wasn't as good and rosy as textbooks write about. Maybe it actually was a really important thing. I mean, it did provide a lot of aid and did prevent communism in many Western European countries. But after knowing that, guys, in conclusion, knowing all that information, this will start the basis for our next lesson tomorrow about the Berlin airlifts and the Berlin airdrops. But this is all foundational information to help you guys out. So today, guys, I want to thank you for joining me, and hopefully you got a great lesson at the origins of the Cold War. That's a wrap.
Best